3 John. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health, just as it is well with your soul. For I was overjoyed when some brothers and sisters arrived and testified to your faithfulness to the truth, how you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on in a manner worthy of God, for they began their journey for the sake of Christ, accepting no support from unbelievers. Therefore, we ought to support such people so that we may become co-workers with the truth. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not welcome us. So if I come, I will call attention to what he's doing in spreading false charges against us. And not content with those charges, he refuses to welcome the brothers and sisters, and even prevents those who want to do so and expels them from the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but imitate what is good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. Everyone has testified favorably about Demetrius, and so has the truth itself. We also testify for him, and you know that our testimony is true. I have much to write to you, but I would rather not write to you with pen and ink. Instead, I hope to see you soon, and we will talk together face to face. Peace to you. The friends send you greetings. Greet the friends there, each by name. God, please fill our minds and our hearts with understanding of your word this morning, and bless our Pastor Brian as he shares with us. Amen.
Good morning. Apologize for the mask. It seemed to come down with a little bit of something last night. Hopefully you can still hear me all right. But I'm also hopeful that you are already feeling edified and blessed regardless of what I say, because you got to listen to an entire book of the Bible this morning. How often can you say that? Admittedly, it is the shortest book in the Bible in terms of words, and so it might be less impressive than it sounds, but you should still wear that with a badge of honor and say to people that you listened to an entire book of the Bible this morning. Now, I say that halfway in jest, but the truth is that I do think that 3 John has a lot of value. And in fact, that these shorter books tend to get neglected in the church. As Laura did a good job illustrating with the kids, I think it's important for us to remember just how much work has gone into bringing this letter to us. There's the fact that the person who wrote it, the elder, had to find the material, and it took some effort to write it, and let alone to send it. And then there's all the people through the centuries who have painstakingly copied it, transcribed it, translated it, to make it so that we can have this part of God's Word in our Bible. I'd say there's probably been hundreds of hours that have gone into making this available to us. And so the least we can do is take some time to listen to what God might have to say to us through this. But I will say that if your experience with 3 John is that you were kind of working your way all the way through the Bible, and you read 2nd John, and then immediately afterwards you read 3rd John, you might have to shake your head and make sure you didn't read the same thing twice, because on the surface they look very similar, right? Both are extraordinarily short books. 2nd John has the least number of verses of any books in the Bible. 3rd John has the least number of words as any book in the Bible. Both are written by someone who calls himself the elder, traditionally understood to be the Apostle John. That might very well be true, but I'm going to stick with what the text says and just refer to him as the elder this morning. And they use very similar language. They talk about walking with the truth. They talk about making our joy complete. For a short letter, this is a lot of overlap. And both books end with this recommendation that they have a fuller conversation when they talk face to face. So that's a lot of overlap for two books that are only about a page long each. But if you look a little closer, you'll find that there are also some significant differences between these two books. And I say this bearing in mind that I preached on 2nd John a few weeks ago, and some of you might recall that I find 2nd John to be kind of a challenging book. I find 3rd John to be a much more uplifting kind of book. So the first thing I'd note is that 2nd John is written to a community, right? So the opening says, "The elder to the elect lady and her children." Presumably that refers to a church congregation. The elect lady and her children represent its members. It's quite possible that this was written during a time when Christians were persecuted, and so they had to speak in kind of this careful, coded language rather than just saying that they were a church explicitly. Excuse me. Whereas in 3rd John, it's written to an individual, specifically someone named Gaius. And in keeping to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth, and in keeping with kind of those differences, the letter of 2nd John is kind of careful not to get into any specifics, not to name names. It talks about a situation, but it uses kind of this general language. Whereas 3rd John is much more direct. It talks about specific people, a specific situation that's going on. We can kind of have a fuller picture. And then I'd say the messages are so different that they're almost opposite in some sense. You might recall that one of the main points of 2nd John is a warning about being too welcoming, that there's a sense in which a church has to have some boundaries. And that should say 2nd John 10, forgive the typo there, but it says, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive them and welcome this person into your home." The teaching was referring to Jesus Christ having come in the flesh. And this is a stark warning that says maybe we should be careful about whom we give access to the church. But in 3rd John, it warns against taking this too far and not being welcoming enough. And specifically, it addresses Gaius saying, "Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, even though they're strangers to you." Now, I find that to be a little bit of an awkward sentence in English, but essentially what I think it's saying is that when you were welcoming to these traveling brothers and sisters, you did the right thing. You were faithful. You made the right choice. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a moment to kind of look at to think about the picture and the situation, right? So let's start by noting that these letters were probably written in a region that we sometimes call Asia Minor or Anatolia. And there were a number of churches in that area. We don't know which one, which city the elder was writing to, but just for the sake of picking one, I'm going to pick Smyrna. Also because I like saying the word Smyrna. That's kind of a Smyrna is a fun one. It kind of starts out by telling us that there were some Christian travelers, missionaries, if you will, who were traveling through the region, as was common in the time. And they had eventually made their way back to the elder and talks about how some brothers and sisters arrived and testified to your faithfulness to the truth. And later speaks about one of them in particular, saying, everyone has testified favorably about Demetrius, and so has the truth himself. We testify about him, and you know that our testimony is true. He's trying to insist to Gaius, look, Demetrius, who is presumably the leader or spokesperson for this group, he's a good guy. He can be trusted. I, as the elder, am going to stand up for him and say, this is a reliable person, which is perhaps something you need when there's lots of people traveling through your town. But as they were traveling and trying to make their way to Smyrna, or wherever it was that they were, there was a certain church leader named Diotrephes. And he kind of took it upon himself to be the guardian of the church community and to try to stop them from coming in. So it starts by saying that Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not welcome us, and goes on to say he refuses to welcome the brothers and sisters and even prevents those who want to do so and expels them from the church. So not only is Diotrephes saying, look, I don't want these visiting people to come into my home, he's saying they shouldn't come in anybody's home. And in fact, if you let them in your home, then we're going to kick you out of the church community too. I mean, this is a person who is being really assertive and doubling down. And you might note that, now hang on a second, isn't that exactly what the elder was saying, that we should be assertive and double ourselves down? Like, be careful about who comes in? Well, apparently not like that. Apparently, whatever it is that Diotrephes was doing, it represents a kind of unhealthy non-Christ-likeness that we should try to avoid. And so fortunately, even though Diotrephes was trying to stick his foot down and assert this kind of leader, there was another individual in the church, a person by the name of Gaius, the recipient of this letter, and he decided, despite this threat, to welcome Demetrius and his traveling companions into his home in Smyrna anyway. So you could see that this was kind of a controversial thing to do. He was taking a risk by welcoming this person into his home, even when there was a church leader who was speaking quite strongly against it. And say, why? Well, what's the difference here? Excuse me. Well, unfortunately, even though we have some more details in 3 John, it's still a very short letter. And so we don't know a lot about the dynamics and what exactly was going on. And once again, as we saw in 2 John, the elder felt like it would be better to have a longer face-to-face conversation about this, so he doesn't go into too much detail into the letter. But we do have a pretty strong hint as to what might be troubling them. Because when the elder first describes this situation, first names this situation to Gaius, he says, beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. That's kind of a strange word to use, if you will. It's a word that has a very negative connotation. It's xenus, which is where words like xenophobia come from in English. It's this connotation that these are people who are outsiders, they are strangers, they're people who are not to be trusted. And I was, in my thinking, the only reason that the elder would use this word to describe these people is if he was copying or repeating what Diotrephes had been saying about them. Diotrephes, probably when speaking to the other members of this church, said, "We can't let these people in. They are strangers. They're not with us. They're people whom can't be trusted." And the elder is saying, "Thank you for letting them in," even though there's some truth to that, that they're not a part of you. Why would this have so much weight, though, in the ancient world? What's wrong with having these kinds of strangers? We have to keep in mind that in ancient Roman society, people relied very heavily on kind of their family circles and kinship group and connections. In fact, oftentimes they saw other people as explicitly or implicitly a threat to them and the interests of the people in their family. So one biblical scholar named David De Silva describes it like this. Excuse me again. He says, the Greco-Roman and Jewish environments were competitive. People outside of an individual's kinship group were viewed as potential rivals and sometimes even antagonists. Honor and its various components, wealth, fame, positions of influence, acknowledged presence, were the prizes for which people competed with one another. Now he goes on to say that, but what you never do is you never compete with people within your own family. This is kind of seen as a team sport, right? There's us and there's them. There's our group and there's the other group, those who aren't with us. And people who are not a part of our group should be treated with suspicion. So whoever these traveling missionaries were, it seems that they didn't have the kind of family or kinship connection to Diotrephes that made him personally comfortable. Maybe he was afraid that they were going to try to persuade them with some kind of teaching that they didn't like. Maybe he thought that they were going to come and try to take away some of their money or resources. And certainly, missionaries often traveled from one part of the world to another to try to raise money as a part of the early church movement. Maybe he was just biased against them because he didn't like their ethnicity or their family background, or something about him made him uncomfortable. But it was enough to make him put his foot down and be exclusive, to exclude people who deserved to be in the church. And unfortunately, this is not something that is just unique to Greco-Roman society. It's a widespread human tendency for us to tend to be suspicious of people whom we see as others, and to put more priority on people whom we see as partners or similar to, or an extended kind of family of ourselves. Consider, excuse me. Consider, for example, that in the United States, we oftentimes hear people talk about immigrants using very negative language and ideas, saying that immigrants are coming to take away our jobs, or they're using our money or our social resources. Well, first of all, that puts a really unnecessary us versus them division in society, when in reality, a number of people who are in the United States, all of us, or the vast majority of us, I should say, were originally immigrated from somewhere else. But then it goes on, and it suggests that somehow these others are a threat to us, even though they're contributing to our community, even though evidence shows that they tend to be less likely to be violent and troubling than other kinds of people. You hear this language sometimes when people complain about the United States giving foreign aid to people in other countries. Why should we be paying for other people when we have so much need in our own country? But once again, this kind of has this sense that there's like this limited number of resources, and undoubtedly there are a limited number of resources, But it takes a competitive view instead of a cooperative view of understanding how helping our neighbors ultimately is good for us as well. Now, these aren't views that I hear expressed at Shalom very often, but this tendency to be xenophobic, to be suspicious towards strangers and others, it can happen to even the most well-intentioned of us. There have been a number of studies that have shown that people, no matter how politically progressive they are, don't like having homeless folks living near their neighborhoods or communities. And so there's kind of this widespread bipartisan agreement that if there's somebody who is too different from us, that we should support legislation, we should support ideas that keep them out. Sometimes when we're talking about our own church community and how we relate to one another and how we do things, and we hear people talk about outsiders or those who aren't quite like us, we have a tendency to be protective and saying, well, no, we do things this way, and we don't necessarily want to change or open ourselves up for them. Or even in the matters that we care about. For those of us who are white, for example, we might find that we have been deeply engaged with the war in Ukraine, that this has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, which it deserves. It is an awful war and an unjust situation that the people of Ukraine are going through. But why is it that we have all this sympathy for people who are in Ukraine and don't pay nearly as much attention to political crises in Ecuador or wars that are occurring in Myanmar or in Sudan? Because in many cases, there might be a little bit of subtle xenophobia at play, something that identifies with people who look or sound or act more like us and are less invested in those who seem less strange or distant or familiar. It's a problem, this xenophobia. It always has been a problem. And we need more people to be like Gaius, who are willing to stand up and welcome, extend welcome to others, even when there's pushback in our communities against it. How does the elder address this? Well, he does it right from the outset already when he talks about this. He says, beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. Excuse me. He notes that, whatever you do for the brothers and sisters, even though they're strangers to you. So he notes that even though there are people who we don't know, they're still our brothers and sisters in Christ. They are part of our extended Christian family. And so we need to reorient our thinking and to think about these people as people who are a part of our beloved Christian community as well. Have the same kind of protective, compassionate instinct for them as we do when we hear about trouble or struggles or suffering of members of our own families or direct communities. But he actually doesn't stop there. He goes on and develops it a bit further and says, you see, they began their journey for the sake of Christ. This is these missionary travelers, Demetrius and his friends, accepting no support from non-believers. Therefore, we ought to support such people so that we may become co-workers with the truth. Not only are these brothers and sisters, not only are they people whom we should welcome into our homes, but they are doing the very work of Christ. The work that God is doing in the world is bigger than any of us can possibly imagine. I don't know about you, but when I do read the news, I think about all of the challenges that we face. It's easy for me to feel overwhelmed. And I have to remind myself that God is big enough to address these issues and is actively working a plan in place to save the world. And a lot of this has to do with reconciling different kinds of people who see themselves as strangers. For example, we have this passage that describes it beautifully in Ephesians. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh he has made both into one and broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility between us, that he might create in himself one new humanity in the place of two, thus making peace. Fortunately for us, God is out there in the world, wherever there is war, wherever there is hatred, wherever there is discrimination. The Spirit of God is at work, reconciling, calling, appealing, seeking to bring people together. But it's not just God at work. As Jesus said, using some of the same language that we find in 3 John, in his final prayer for his disciples, as you, God, have sent me into the world, so I have sent them, my disciples, into the world. And for their sakes I sanctified myself, so that they may also be sanctified in truth. These travelers, these missionaries who are bringing a different kind of culture, a different kind of reality into the presence of Diotrephes and other people who may be uncomfortable with it, they are representing the very work of God. Not only are they doing that, but they are giving that community, the people of Smyrna or wherever it was, an opportunity to become co-workers in this ministry of truth. Now, I bring this up today largely because we are fortunate that some of our missionary families are here with us today. We're grateful to have Peter and Delicia and their children here with us. And I think it's important for us to remember that when they speak to us and share about their experiences, it's not just that we are listening to some kind of interesting story, but that we have people who have dedicated themselves wholly to the work of God, not being funded by any kind of special interests or anything else that might split their loyalties, who are inviting us to be co-workers with the truth, to be co-workers in this global work of reconciliation. We're not all called to travel. We're not all capable of leaving. But when we welcome and listen to one another and support one another, every one of us has an opportunity to be co-workers in God's reconciling work.